Hi everyone, George here. Welcome to another episode of Boss VG Reviews. Usually we try to review the newest games out, so you can figure out which new releases are worth your hard-earned money, but today I'll be reviewing Final Fantasy XIII. I understand the game may be almost a year old, but I want to take the time to review it. While that may sound a little odd, here's a little context. One of my very first blog posts on bossvg.com was a rant about how little I liked this game, so I decided it was time to give it a second chance. Plus, I was laid up in bed over the weekend with an injury, so I decided to play one of the few PS3 games in my collection that I hadn't beat, and went for the longest out of all of them. For those of you unfamiliar with Final Fantasy games, the fuck's wrong with you? The game series has been around since the 80s and has been a staple of the JRPG genre for the longest time. Perhaps the most famous out of the series has been Final Fantasy VII. The combat has been typically a turn-based affair, but with this iteration they try to mix it up a little bit. While you're still selecting between options to attack or defend, you only control one character out of your party as opposed to three, and instead of each being able to do many things, they stick to one role. The roles are what makes combat interesting, and as you customize certain roles for your characters to fill before battle, switching between them becomes the key to winning. The system mostly works well, and I love how more involved the combat is, but it does have its share of flaws. Sometimes the game will force you into certain roles, like Sentinel, which is essentially a tank, and erase your compositions, so you'll have to redo them again when you get your right party. Also, I really didn't have fun when I was forced to play the Sentinel role, as it mainly consists of taunting all the enemies repeatedly and blocking. The system could also be made better if it didn't take a few seconds during combat to switch between team compositions, and for that matter, maybe giving a few more composition slots to create would be amazing. I also mentioned earlier how you can't control your party members. This can cause a few deaths, as a healer may not always heal the party leader, and if your party leader dies, it's game over. Battles are also no longer a random affair, as monsters are visibly running around. This allows you to ambush certain monsters, which immediately fills their chain gauge. Speaking of the chain gauge, it's basically something that fills up as you fight monsters, and once the gauge is full, you can then inflict a much greater amount of damage to the enemy while the gauge drains. This is crucial to defeating certain enemies, as, for example, it can make an enemy who's immune to physical damage suddenly weak to physical damage. RPGs are always known for their stories, and the Final Fantasy series is no exception. The story of Final Fantasy XIII is a little hard to follow in the beginning, and it throws a lot of terminology at you early on, but as the story progresses, you get a better sense of what the characters are all talking about. Something that really bothers me though is that this game is 90% cinema, 10% gameplay. While it's no new thing to a Final Fantasy game to have a ton of cutscenes, it's getting a little old that Square Enix, the creator of the game, is really just selling us $60 movies. The cinematics are getting longer and longer, and soon we'll have to fight one or two battles only after watching the heroes grind for a few hours. As for the graphics and sound, this game is amazing on all counts. Square Enix has never been one to slouch when it comes to showing off their artistic talent, sound included. This game is definitely best played when in 1080p with 5.1 surround sound. I know I enjoyed it that much more. I have to say I was wrong a year ago when I talked shit about this game. It's a fun game that, although it has its flaws, definitely deserves to be played by the RPG fans. To total the score, this game has a solid story once you understand it, fun and engaging combat system, and it looks and sounds great. On the flip side though, it's a 40+ hour movie, it takes a few hours to get into, and sometimes the combat can be a little frustrating and clunky. I would definitely recommend purchasing this game if you're looking for an RPG to tide you over until Dragon Age 2 comes out. Looking past its flaws, it's a great addition to the Final Fantasy series. Thanks again for joining me, George signing out.
The font of Eden's power. Orphan fuels Eden with strength, and Eden in turn sustains you and the rest of our kind.
Did you say an orphan?
Yeah, a little orphan boy.
It's powered by a forsaken child?
Might be, kind of. I mean, I didn't use the whole thing.